Hi. So today we'll talk about time, or more keeping track of time. So we'll go over components and also flux. So let's start off with some flux first. If we move over here, we have still some free space. If we go into our node browser with our flux tip, and then find ourselves the time section here, we have quite a few things. For example, at the very bottom, we have world time float. This is basically just how long the world has been open, represented as a float in seconds. Now, you also see here world time double. Now, what world time double is, it's basically the exact same thing, but with more precision. World time 2 float is just the world time multiplied by 2. World time 10 float is just the world time multiplied by 10. These are just shortcuts so that you don't have to manually multiply it. And in the same way, we also have world time half float and world time 10 float. Now, these are all of the ways that you can keep track of time in the most basic way. Although, additionally, we have UTC now, which is just the current UTC time. If you need to actually keep track of the real world time, not the time of the world. This will output basically the UTC time that it currently is at. Now, we also, in here, have things like the stopwatch. Now, what the stopwatch allows you to do is it allows you to start and stop, as well as a reset, a little animation, which is what it uses internally. Now let's just quickly get all of these out to showcase it. If I start, this will start keeping track of time that has elapsed. You'll also get a pulse up here from the on start. If I stop, it'll pulse here and freeze on the exact time, and you can also see the is running is now false again. However, it's not going to reset it. It will only reset once we actually call reset here, which will pulse here and then reset this back to 0. Now, as I said, internally this uses an animation, and we do have a more simpler version of it. The simpler version is elapsed time. So let's use elapsed time float. And again, double would just be a more precise version, and elapsed time span would just give you it as a time span. So I'll show the time span really quickly. And as you can see, we have it right there. And it just starts off from when it was created or when you last pulsed it. So to show this in a way that makes more sense, let's go back to just floats. So here we have elapsed time float. Right now, it's at 367, 3680, and so on. If we pulse it, it resets to 0. Now, this is very useful to use in more simple things where every time you perform the function, you actually reset the time first. Now, what this would be, for example, is if you have a tool where you need to see how long it was held down for, you could pulse when holding down, check this value here, and if the user is still holding the button, and also this value here is greater than a certain number, you can then trigger whatever you want else. Or if you, for example, have something like a charge attack, you could reset it when you press down the trigger, charge it up over the time, and if the user lets go, so once the primary is false again, you could check this number here, and if the number is greater than a certain value, then do the action. There's a lot of things that elapsed time is useful for, and it's a lot simpler than the stopwatch. However, there is also a few cases where stopwatch is very useful, especially with its stop function, where you can just freeze it on a certain value, so that value basically stays there and you can keep referencing it. It just really depends on what your use case is. Now, beyond that, we also have some time span functions in here that allow us to convert the time span to days. We can get it also from days. So for example, if we, for example, had a float value or actual double value that represents 10 days, we could convert that into a time span. Now, most of these are just conversions or just things that give you a specific thing about the time span. Oh, right, we don't have an input for this yet. I forgot about that. But yeah, we also have date time, which is for these here, where we can, for example, construct date time by giving it a month, let's say 6, for example, an hour, let's say 4, and milliseconds, we'll say 99. And this is actually not precise enough currently to show us the milliseconds. We have to specifically, I think, ask for the milliseconds in this way, and that should return 99. There we go. So the reason this is currently not displaying milliseconds is just because it's not set to that kind of format. You could also change what type the time here is, so that, for example, you could make it this based off of your own local time. So if I was to put in 8 a.m., for example, it would interpret this as 8 a.m. as interpreted in my time zone. So if you had someone else's time zone, you could then convert it to UTC. You could interpret it as UTC, and that would just allow you to then compare against here. And if it was 8 a.m. in UTC, you could compare against current UTC and check if it's greater or smaller. And yeah, it allows you to do some very nice stuff to do with real world time. Next, we also have something called delta time, which is another way of keeping track of a type of time. Delta time, however, is a bit more vague. What delta time actually is the time between frames. So basically, this is how long it took for a frame to update. Now, using this, you can actually multiply it by a value to ensure that the change between frames remains always consistent. So over 60 frames, for example, you actually had the same amount of change as if you just had 30 frames within the same time span. It is very useful for that, and definitely one of the most useful things. And there is also variants of it, if I remember correctly, that actually, yeah, that are also like pre-variants where they also already have a function. For example, here's divided by delta time, which just any value you give it here will be divided by delta time, which generally will make the number larger. And then there's also mul delta time, which multiplies it by delta time, which generally will make any number smaller. Multiply by delta time is what you usually want to use. Now, moving on from Flux to components, we will need to swap out our Flux tip for a dev tip. We'll create a new slot, an empty one, and attach a component. We go to transform, because there's no time category here, and the way that we keep track of time in here actually is in drivers. One of the things we have here is the timeInt driver. Now what the timeInt driver does is it outputs time as an integer. So if we get an integer value field here and attach this like that, you'll see that it slowly counts up. Now, one difference between the components here is that this doesn't actually give you the current world time or your real world time. It's just ticking every x. So for example, if I change the scale to 10, it would actually be counting up a lot faster. If I change it to -1, for example, on the scale, we actually are starting to go into the negatives. So this basically just keeps track of something similar to elapsed time, but with no real way to reset it. However, we can repeat. So if we set this to 10, for example, instead of counting infinitely up to the maximum number that it has, it just goes from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. And you might be thinking, hold on, we're repeating at 10, so why does it not go to 10? And the thing is because integers are actually exclusive, which means the number that they repeat at does not actually appear. So for example, if I wanted to do 1, 2, 3, or 0, 1, 2, 3, I'd have to do 4. So you always have to be 1 higher than where you try to arrive at with integers. Now, beyond the timeInt driver, we also have another neat thing called function drivers. We currently only have the time sign driver. Now what the time sign driver does is actually really neat, because within Flux here, what we would usually do in order to get a sign function is that we would take a time node, and then once we have our time node, we would go to trigonometry and get sine, plug time into sine, and this would output us a sine wave that goes from -1 to 1. Now, this is not that difficult of a setup. However, if you then want to change this range here to be a little bit more usable, you would go to operators and go to 0, 1, 0, 1 float. Actually, not 0, 1, sorry. That was just a short circuit there. We go to math because we need value. Oh yeah, remap 11 to 0, 1. And the 11 actually is a small mistake because this is not 11 to 0, 1. This is -1 to 1 to 0, 1, 1. So this will actually shift this value to go from 0 to 1 instead of from -1 to 1. And then once we have this, we would then also have to go back to operators. And in operators, get ourselves a multiply, go to value multiply, and then we can get ourselves a value multiply float, multiply this by 10, and now finally we have a value that goes from 0 to 10, and this is the amount of nodes we needed for that. However, with the time sign driver, we just go to data, let's make ourselves a field to visualize it, slot this value here into the target, and as you can see, it already goes from -1 to 1, and it has a speed, so we can modulate the speed, which would be done over here by simply adding a multiply in front of this, so that is even more of a thing that you need to preset up. Actually, we did 5, so sorry. So let's do that here too. And now you can see this goes as fast as 5, and it's basically the same here. Now, in order to change the range like we did here, all we have to do really is we take 10, put it as the max, and then change the minimum to 0. So basically, these two setups here, this larger one with the actual nodes directly, and this one here, are exactly equal. They do the exact same thing over time. And that is pretty much the most important things that you need to know about keeping time, except for timers. Now, timers I already covered in another video, and I suggest you check that out if you want to know how to basically cause an impulse every X seconds, for example, or every X updates. Other than that, I hope this helped you, and I hope you build something great. Enjoy your day or night. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.